Want to print models bigger than your printer? I'll show you a quick and easy way to do it in Bambu Slicer with no extra design software required. I use this exact method for a real client project that was featured on live TV. In this webinar, I'll show you exactly how I did it so you can use the same workflow on your own prints. Let's jump in. This is a nice, quick and easy way that you can make huge assemblies in Bambu Studio without any fancy equipment or extra software. So I thought I wanted to work you guys through an example from one of the businesses that I have with my partner. And this one here we did for a client. At first we were like, I don't know if this is possible to print, especially with the colors. And then they're like, oh, we need it to be about 1/2 meter tall. And at that point I'm like, okay, let's just keep going and see where this goes. And I chucked it into a AI generator program, and it actually came out really, really nice. So the client, I said, yep, we can do it. However, we can't color it, it'll need to be painted. And they're like, thank God my niece is a talented artist, so let's get this going. And from that step forward, the challenge was then creating this piece that was about 1/2 meter tall, or 400 mils. I said, okay, let's just do it in Bambu Studio and let's give it a go with the connectors. So you can see here, first design done, then the cut. This is one of the 4 pieces here in the middle image. And then on the right, once it was painted, you can see here the final product. And it came out absolutely wonderful. It actually worked first try. There was no mucking around really. And it was really quite simple to do. So I want to share this with you guys because it's a really easy way to make large parts. Then actually the clients were so happy with it that they came back and wanted another 2 designs here. So then we did that, and doing it a second time, exact same process, worked again. So trialed and tested, you can see there. This was actually displayed in Chatston at one of the pop-up stores that they had. But let's get into the technical side of now how to actually do this. And I promise that you guys will be able to do it. There's a few things here that you need to think about, and I'll walk you through them. If you're ever stuck, you can come back to these 5 points and they will help you complete the process. Where you want to make your cut is really, really important. Then if they need any supports, how the print's orientated, what type of connectors to use. And really the last point is super, super important, and that's plate adhesion. I'll get to that in a bit and why that's important. But if you have prints that warp, then you'll have a gap between the connected components, and that can ruin the whole aesthetic of the print. So let's go to the slicer here. So I just took this off Maker World, but you can use any model. Right now it's 100 mils. What I did was I just typed in 400 here. Now, obviously that is really big compared to the size of the printer, and you can't slice it. So what you can do from here is start to think about where you want the cuts and the least amount of cuts that we can use to complete this model. So I can start by putting in some beds. I think it's going to be at least 3 prints here. So is it possible to cut the heads and maybe just have the body? Then we can print the body and the head in 2 different prints. That would be really nice. That's obviously not going to work, as we can see that the shoulders hang over the bed here. So we can't do that. So it's going to have to be minimum 3. And when you leave it like this, it'll be separate. And let's take Superman and put him here. Essentially, we know that this is good to print. Now over here, we want to have a think about how we could best cut this to print it with the least amount of parts. So obviously the shoulders are quite large. So the simplest solution that has just come to mind is straight down the middle. This actually is possible to print in 1 part. Now, let's get this first connector going. So for the first cut here, it's really important to think about where you want this cut. So if I cut him, for example, here, you're going to notice a seam at this point. You could cut him around the neck here, but we know that the shoulders are a bit too big, so that's probably not going to fit on the bed. If you can hide the cut along the line of the design is the most ideal outcome. I'm going to go for right up here because you're probably not going to notice it too much. Now, before we hit cut, it's really important. We're going to chat about the next point, which is connectors. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail, and I'm just going to give you what works for me, and I think it will work for you. So you can see here, that's my connector. So let's undo, and we're going to increase the size of the connector. So let's make that a little bit smaller. Let's just go for 30 and 30. That's nice. So a circular connector is actually useful here if you wanted the head to swivel. If you didn't glue that in, the head could swivel around. If you didn't want the head to swivel, I like to use square. Now, there's not a right or wrong answer, but I like to use square because it mechanically locks it in. And then when you add in the glue, you're doubling down on it to really make sure that it's not going to move. Now, the problem with one is he might turn into a bit of a bobblehead. And if there's a bit of play there, the head can start to move around. So you could go for 2 connectors. So I'm just going to go with that and we can move on. Now, there's a few types here. There's a plug and there's a dowel, and then there's these other 2. A plug connector means that when you print this, these parts here will be permanently fixed on this model. So when you print this, well, one, it adds height to the model. So if you're trying to get as large of a print as possible, that could make the print not printable because they're so tall. The other thing is if your tolerances are off, which sometimes you might just have the wrong filament setting on, there might have to be a bit of moisture in the filament, and you might just have a slight change in tolerances, you would have to print one of these models again from scratch. So I recommend using dowel. The difference is that when you click on dowel, it actually creates a hole. So when we click confirm and perform cut, now they're separate. And you go, oh, okay, there's a hole there. There's also a hole here. Great. Oh, it's actually added my connectors as a separate part here just automatically. This I recommend pretty much all the time. But why I like this is, again, if your tolerances are off, then you don't have to reprint any of these big models. You can just reprint these, which is like, what, 30 cents or something like that. It's also a nice way to find what tolerance you like. So let's go to the next part and we will talk about how to tolerance these. What size should they be? So if we make this next cut here, for the sake of the workshop, I'm going to cut it straight down the middle. But you might go, oh, this is the really important part of the Superman. I don't really want there to be a line straight down the middle of him. Is there maybe a more clever way to hide the cut? Well, it would be ideal to do it this way, but we know that the shoulders are too big. So maybe we could do an angled cut and then hide it along over here. Would that work? I think the model might still be too big, but for the sake of the workshop, I'm just going to cut him straight down. But that's just something to note, that how you position your model, how it's sized up, it's something that you should have a think about before. And where you place the connectors is also quite important, because you can see, luckily, the way I've placed them, they're not interfering with the connector, which is just something good to avoid. So before I hit perform cut, I just nearly botted out and defaulted to perform cut. We're going to hit add connectors again. And you can see when I rotate around the different sides, you get this sort of clipping. Now, this is actually a negative part here, but let's just work with it. So you can see that there's a negative part here, so I can't add any connectors there because it'll be cut out. We're going to keep the same connector length and use all the same if possible. And you could just add one connector there, but it's probably not going to be enough for the size of this model. So what we can do is add a reasonable amount that you think. Like, obviously you can just do that, but then that's going to be quite time consuming. So I think it makes sense to go for something like this, one up here, and you could squeeze one in here. If for whatever reason it was a really tight space, you can actually change the size on the fly and go, all right, let's add two here. So let's go back to the 30 and 30. And while we're here, this is the last connector step, is the tolerances. So the tolerances that I used for the previous connectors, I'd probably have to go back and change, because 0.1 is really tight. In my experience, you're going to be trying to jam it in and it's probably going to get stuck, especially with corners and 3D printing, how they can sometimes curl and things like that. Maybe for a circle, 0.1 is a really nice snug fit. But for the squares, you can go 0.3, and I would just go 0.3 for, and that is just a safe tolerance to start off with. The worst thing that you want to do is start off with a really tight tolerance, and then you get a connector jammed in this big print. You got to do it all again. So start off with something a little looser. Let's fit that guy in there, and then I'm going to click perform. You can see there that the part starts to now come to life. So now the last part is orientating it so it's nice to print. One last thing I will mention about the square connectors that's really nice. If for whatever reason I had to print the model like this, these parts don't need support because there's a nice 45-degree angle the whole way up. So let's say I hope to print the model like this, which makes sense. So if you can see now, they would struggle and you would start to have a bit of drooping, and then the tolerance comes into play, then the connector might not fit. So what you can do is in the last step, when you add the connectors, there's another dial up there that is for rotating the connectors. So you might want to rotate them so that there's no supports required. Oh, it might only be on Orca Slicer actually. I believe on Orca Slicer, there's another setting here that is rotate. I'm not sure if this software needs to be updated, but in Orca Slicer, there's an added rotate feature here, which is handy to know. And that is essentially the method that I used to get these models, and it took me only about 1 hour to actually cut it up. And honestly, majority of that hour was me going, oh, that connector's not going to work, I've got to go back. And then for the following two models, I knew what to do, what sort of mistakes I made, and they were a lot quicker. So if you've got it all planned out in your head before you start actually taking action in Bambu Slicer, it'll make your life a lot easier and you'll do it quicker. So the last thing I should have in here, which is the warping of parts and how that can affect your model. So you can see here with this model, you can't see any cuts despite printing it in 4 parts. And that's because I really considered the client wants it to be positioned front on here. So what I did was cut it down the other plane, then you won't see the cuts. So that's an important point. But also when you're printing these big models and you are joining them, any warping that you get, even with a perfect print and no warping, you're still going to see some sort of line. Like, it's hard to see, but you can just see a bit of a seam, but you're going to still see a seam just naturally. So to reduce the seam as much as possible, bed adhesion is so important. Add a brim for all of the parts. Like, it'll take you some time to clean up, but you will regret it spending 20 hours on a print and then they don't fit together nicely. So if you've got an adhesive spray, especially on these little thin bits there that are prone to warping, use it. Use a brim and max it out until it touches the end of the bed. You'll have hot spots, and generally the middle of the bed is really nice and hot, and the edges is where you'll start to find warping. So especially for printing large models, use big brims. With the brim settings, I would recommend going to outer brim only. I max it out. Sometimes I'm on 13, 15 if it's like reaching the end. And this one here, I would put that to 0. That means that you are essentially so close that it's like a normal layer. And when you slice here, the brim will be really difficult to take off. But if you use one of those edge cleaning up tools, sorry, I forgot what it's called, but this brim here will be hard to take off, but you won't regret it because the part will be nice and flat, and you can peel it off and then use the metal scraping tool to clean the brim up. Because you can imagine if that warps and it turns into a curve, when you put it on top of the shoulders, you'll notice more of a gap. So that is my way of quickly doing some assemblies in Bambu Slicer. Now, there are some limitations to this method. It really only works well if you're going to be printing 3, 4 separate cuts and big parts. But I do have a recommendation if you are interested in printing like meter tall components. So the limitations is that it's hard to deal with large models because it starts to get messy in Bambu Slicer. Also, one thing that frustrates me with it is that it's hard to go back. So if you want to go back and modify where the cut is or where the connectors are, it's a little annoying and you usually have to start again. I can recommend this next tool if you want to print something like this. So it's called Lubin. It's actually free to use and it'll do all the cuts for you, which has its benefits, which means it's quick. But the downside is that you will see all the cuts. They're not really optimized. There might be a way to do it in the program, but check it out. And that is how these people print these massive cool things like this. The reason why you can't see where the cuts are is because someone here has used some filler and sanded it and they've taken a long time. It's probably taken them months to make this. But obviously, sometimes you just got to go full course if you want it to be this epic. So check it out, guys. If you print something like this, you have to drop it in the school community so we can see it because that is just so cool. So this is the school community. Obviously, you guys joined from it, but if you print something like that, please post it up. I would love to see it. Thank you so much for joining me on my first solo school webinar. Hopefully you learned a thing or two today, and I'm going to open it up for a Q&A now. So if you've got any questions, ask away.